Welcome to talking about IT standards acronym soup. Before I start my presentation, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So for those that don't know me, my name's Kieran Jacobsen. I'm the Head of Business Systems at Focus Software. Focus Software is a 20-year-old business. Still see ourselves as a startup that makes great data analytics software. We have been for about 20 years now. My role, I'm responsible for all of our internal systems, from desktops, laptops, the network, all the way through to our banking and finance systems. I'm responsible for integrating them all, deploying them all, and trying to put as much automation in as possible. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, and I'm also a GitKraken ambassador. So as the title suggests, when it comes to information security and compliance and privacy standards, there's a lot out there, and there's a lot of acronyms that you need to get your head around. And organisations might need to actually consider and be compliant to multiple standards. And that depends really on what industries they're part of, what markets, what countries they're operating in, but also where their customers might be located as well. So let's start to have a look at some of them. First, we've got the independent standards. We've got SOC 1 and SOC 2, and their separate variants, Type 1 and Type 2. And then we've got SOC 3, which is sort of the end state we'll talk about a bit later. We've got the Cloud Security Alliance, or CSA, and their STAR program, which includes attestation, certification, and self-assessments. Then we've got the ones that everybody knows of and is afraid of, ISO, and ISO 27001 is probably the one that everybody's heard of here. ISO 27017 and 18 are cloud provider specific standards. One specifies additional security controls, the other specifies additional privacy controls. And ISO 27701 basically extends the 27001 ISMS model with a privacy equivalent of the same sort of process or system. The US government has an absolute truckload. These are the more popular ones, but there's probably another 30 or 40 that they operate. Most of the other governments around the world, they don't want to miss out and have their own standards. We have IRAP here in Australia. New Zealand has ISPC. India has the MEITY. Japan has two, CS Mark and ISM Map. South Korea has the KSMS, and Singapore has the MTCS. Then we have some specific ones for different parts, different industry verticals. In Australia, we have APRA. They're putting out a bunch of standards that banking institutions and finance institutions here in Australia need to comply with. We've got the commonly known PCIE DSS, which is oriented around protecting credit card data and credit card information. Banks and sort of processing agencies will need to follow that one. If you've got operations in America or companies, your company's operating out of America, you're probably familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX. That's a very big financial standard over there. The US has also got for healthcare HIPAA and a related high trust standard. And then US education has FERPA, which I just love the name. There's something about that one that's astounding. And power distribution in the US also has NERC, which is it's very close to nuke in my opinion. We then have some privacy related standards. Everybody's familiar with GDPR. The European Union put that one out. It's applicable to any organisation that's processing the data of European citizens. So even if you're an Australian company, if you've got European customers, you need to be GDPR compliant. There's also the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. It's very similar in writing and terminology as GDPR, and it has the same obligations that if you've got Californian customers and Californian data, you've got to be compliant with that one. The final one I've got is called B Corp. And that one, probably most people haven't heard about. It's sort of new. It's not really focused on security or privacy or compliance. Its actual focus is around companies meeting sustainability goals and sustainability, social sustainability performance standards. They will also need to meet, if they're compliant, accountability standards. And depending on the rating that they get through the assessment process, there's certain levels of public transparency that they have to have as well. For a standard that's really focused about sort of societal impacts in the environment, it actually has a security subset. Recently going through it, and yes, I had to sit down with auditors and answer some questions around things like password security policy and stuff like that. So even though it's not directly being driven by IT departments and customers, it might be coming from, say, your people and culture teams, your HR teams, or the executive leadership. If you hear that they're talking about that one, and you're involved in the certification efforts for your organisation, be aware that that one might be coming across your desk. I'm going to focus specifically on two standards quite a lot today, and that's SOC 2 with a little bit of SOC 3 and ISO 27001, because they're probably the most common that everyone in IT is going to face at some point. So why would an organisation want to be compliant with the standard? What value does it bring to an organisation? If you start to look around the internet, you start to look at consulting firms and services that are around, or the auditors and their organisations, there's some common themes that come out. And typically this is improving productivity and reducing costs. The argument is you implement these processes, you implement these things, your processes are better, your documentation improves, you reduce all the waste in your different processes and streamline them all, and that reduces costs. You reduce the number of errors you're getting in the environment, and you reduce the length and frequency of outages. If you're a manager like myself and you're under a lot of pressure to do more with less budget and less team, these sort of things sound really attractive. It sounds like something that I need to do to help support my organisation. There's also some legal requirements as well. There's a drive to conform to international standards. There's some discussions around what's international and not. There's also conforming to industry practices. So if you're a financial institution, you need to start complying to some of these things. It might be from a legal perspective or just a peer pressure thing. Certain governments will require you to be compliant with some of these standards. For example, GDPR. You might need to be compliant with them to go for government contracts as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of that. The other thing is that they can start to help you comply with all the other little bit of auditing and government requests that you might have. So you might go down the path of doing SOC 2 because you know that you've got all these processes in place that help you comply with this legal requirement here, this government act, this thing here. So that's another reason why some companies start to go down that path of a cert. Now for the three that cause me confusion, because I think these are really interesting claims and I find them very hard to validate. I've seen claims that, in particular, ISO 27001 certification is going to improve your employee morale. Your employees are going to be happier when you've got ISO 27001, says one website. More amazingly, they also talk about the fact that it'll reduce headcount, reduce turnover. So that means it'll reduce the number of people who want to leave your business. That's kind of pushing it as well, I think. And then the other one is that it makes you more attractive to new candidates and it gives you more recruiting opportunities. There are claims that candidates might pick one business over another based on whether it's ISO 27001 certified or not. It's not something that I normally think of when I'm looking at a potential employer, is whether they're ISO or SOC 2 compliant. So that's a bit of a push for me. I don't think going and getting ISO 27001 is going to solve your corporate culture issues. Probably the opposite. It's not a silver bullet, that's for sure. Excuse me for a second. The other thing, and this is a bit more of a cynical view in my opinion, is that many organisations go down the path of certification because their customers and so on want that. It's true that certifications beget certifications. Consider the scenario of Contoso. They're a software or a consulting firm. They've been building solutions for customers for decades. But they want to start to grow their business. They want to move into an enterprise market. And they've been trying to sell to Fabricam for a long while. Fabricam recently became CatDog 1 certified. As part of that certification, they now have a vendor review process that they need to complete for every new vendor. As they're working with Contoso to sign all the contracts and complete this deal, Fabricam mentions to Contoso, you know, if you had CatDog 1, this process would be so much easier. It's just a checkbox. We wouldn't need to go through all these paperwork. We wouldn't need to go through all of this effort. And so Contoso starts to think, or starts to feel a bit pressured really, that, you know, if we get CatDog 1, we're going to get more sales. And so they go down the path of a CatDog 1 certification. But then what does this mean to Contoso's vendors, like Northwind Traders and Prosware? They're now in the same position that Contoso just was. They've got to get vendor certified by Contoso. They've got to complete all this paperwork. So now they go down the path of CatDog 1. And then their vendors go down the path. And then their vendors' vendors go down the path. So you can start to see this lovely little, I don't want to say pyramid, but it's sort of a pyramid of vendors and those that they rely on needing to start to get certified just because someone at the top of the chain got CatDog 1 certification. Once again, it's probably a cynical interpretation of what's happening, but it really, you know, when I start to talk to sales teams and I start to talk to IT teams, a lot of it is we're getting certified because our customers keep demanding it. If you ask the customers, they're like, because our customers demand it. So you've got this chain of pressure to get certified. So what does the process of getting one of these certs, going through and becoming compliant with a standard actually look like? And what does it mean to your organisation? So let's start with SOC 2. It's often called an American standard because it comes from an American organisation, which is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, or AICPA. But in reality, it's becoming more of an international standard. As we become more global, our organisations start to run in multiple different areas, have operations in different areas. SOC 2 is becoming more prevalent across the board. SOC 2 actually has its roots back to the 70s in SAS 1, which was an original accounting standard that came from the AICPA. And over the next 20 years, it went from just focusing on financial controls within a company to starting to need to cover other stuff as HR and finance roles started to become outsourced as we started to pick up cloud computing. And so what they did was they felt like there was a need for, as an accountancy for, certification, and really start looking at the organisation's security as a whole. And so in 2010, they released, as part of an updated version of their SAE 16, which is the latest version of all of their compliance docs, SOC 1, SOC 2 and SOC 3. And that's been updated a few years later in SSAE 18, which is now the standard, the applicable standard. SOC 1 still focuses on those financial statements and their processing and controls. SOC 2 follows and really focuses on what's called the 5 trust service criteria. And then you've got SOC 3, which is essentially the same report as SOC 2, but they go and take all of the really sensitive information about how your network works and what the actual processes are. They take that out, and that means you could hand a SOC 3 report to anybody in the public, and you're not going to be worried about sensitive IT processes, being leaked to people that shouldn't know about it, or requiring non-disclosure agreements to share that information. The 5 trust services criteria are security, availability, process integrity, confidentiality and privacy. But if you want to go and get a SOC 2 you go through the SOC 2 compliance process, you only need to do security. You don't need to do the other 4. So what happens is a lot of organisations, they'll go and just do the security, then maybe the next year they'll add another one on, or they'll add a few more on. And this gives you sort of a smaller sort of scope. You're not having a massive scope that you have to try and do in one, for 1 year. You can break that up. It doesn't overload your IT teams with so much work that, you need to hire more people and stuff. You can do it a bit more piecemeal. Then there's the option of SOC 2 Type 1 and SOC 2 Type 2. Type 1 is just a review of the design of your controls. So think of it as somebody who's going through and just reading the architecture docs you've put together, the design documents, and going, yep, that looks like it's going to work. That's what Type 1 does. Type 1 you can do within 7 to 10 business days. If you've got everything ready, you can ring up an auditor, they'll look at it and be back to you within a week, and you can have that done. Typically they say it takes longer because you've got to try and put everything together, but the auditors have, said and do advertise that if you've got everything ready, under 7 days, or under 10 days really. SOC 2 Type 2 extends what's in Type 1 and really starts to look at, are the controls that you've now implemented working? So you've got these different processes in place. Have they worked over a period of time, like the last 3 to 12 months? If you're doing this cert for the first time, you're doing this accreditation for the first time, you might just do the 3-month period, the last 3 months that you've had it running. But if it's your renewal, you'll do the last 12 months. SOC 2, you don't really end up with a certificate. You don't have this little award that says, your company has achieved SOC 2. Instead, you end up with what's called an attestation report. I think this is actually more valuable. The report describes the controls and the systems and processes that you've got in place to comply with what's in the standard. Even if you fail, you get a report. And that report will tell you what you need to improve and what you need to do to actually start to pass. And it describes in terminology of, that you've passed, or you've passed with, changes that might need to be made, or you've essentially what's called unqualified, which is failed, or there is a term which is called disclaimer of opinion, when they just haven't had enough information to decide whether you meet the needs or not. And so from a internal perspective, instead of just getting a piece of paper, you've now got a report that might also start to help you drive what changes need to happen in your environment. If you've been trying to get budget for a new MDM solution for years, and the report comes back and goes, your device management, your mobile phone management is terrible, you need to do something about that, you've now got a report that you can use as IT to try and make these changes. As I said earlier though, the SOC 2 report contains a bunch of sensitive stuff. And that's where SOC 3 comes in. SOC 3, they go and scrub all of that. You can now put your SOC 3 report up on your website. You can use it as part of your marketing materials. You can hand it to every potential customer and they can start to see at least a brief overview of what your security and your privacy sort of processes are like. And that's really quite powerful. As part of that report, it'll say which of those trust criteria areas were included in the assessment. SOC 2 audits expire every year. And so that does mean you need to go through the process each year, but certainly as you go through, you get faster at it. With the fact that SOC 2 is more attestation based, it opens itself up to more automation. And there are a lot of vendors out there that have tools that will go and look at your environment and you can almost in real time see where your status is. You can see how close am I to being passing or not passing as things change in your environment. It then makes the auditing process even easier because a lot of the auditors can now be given a login to those tools and all the evidence they need to be able to complete your attestation is there ready for them to go. So you don't have these emails back and forward trying to share screenshots and documents and Excel files. They've got it all there, which makes it much, much easier and reduces the stress on everybody. For me, SOC 2 is a lot less disruptive than all of the other standards. Because you can look at your current processes, and if you've already got security processes in place, you're probably going to be able to get some level of assessment done and probably be in compliance. If you've followed common sense, you'll probably be compliant with those. I think as well that you can look at doing the type 1 first and then the type 2. Organisations and some of those involved will tell you, no, that's more expensive, you should just go straight to type 2. But I think doing the review of what you've designed before actually implementing it and then getting it assessed is a lot more of a more of a software development approach almost of, let's test the software before we put it into production. ISO 27001, as I said, it causes fear in a lot of IT pros, especially IT managers and decision makers. It's actually really called ISO IEC 27001, and it's published by the International Organisation for Standardisation, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, or IEC. The original version of this is pretty new. It only really came about in 2005, so it doesn't have as much maturity as some of the other standards. It was revised in 2013. There was some pretty good revisions. There's a bunch of things that are missing that we were hoping would be there, but just didn't make it. There's also an update for European organisations that happened in 2017. Accreditation for the ISO certification is actually done by a separate body to ISO and IEC. And that is ANSI ASQ, the National Accreditation Board, and there's equivalents in each country. So now you've got a standard that's been created by one set of orgs, and the accreditation is actually being done by another, so there's a bit more separation. 27001 is centred around what's called the Information Security Management System, or ISMS. The ISMS really is a set of documents and processes that set out how the business deals with information security, how they're going to establish and things like communicating with stakeholders and working out their expectations, managing risks and identifying risks, defining controls and other mitigations for those risks, and also setting some objectives around what needs to be achieved. There's also a big part of ISO 27001, which is a set of mandatory controls that you need to have in place. And you've got to then be able to prove and measure the effectiveness of how you've implemented controls, implemented those controls. There's also processes around continuous improvement and how you're sort of refining your processes and your policies to ensure that they're keeping up to date with the latest threats and things like that. ISO 27001 audits come in 3 stages. The first, or stage 1, is really just an informal view of your ISMS. They take a look at it, they go, yep, that looks good, but it's nothing formal. It's sort of a way for your auditors and the organisation to sort of become familiar with each other. It's sort of like a team building, sort of greeting activity. Stage 2 is the formal review of the ISMS, and that's where it's certified as being compliant. So a big part of it is, it's not the business so much that's being validated as being compliant, but it's your ISMS that's being validated as compliant, and therefore your business is. Then there's the final stage, which is called the ongoing stage. Basically, this is a period of time where there's ongoing assessments to review and ensure that the business is actually following the processes that it said that it has in place. The review sort of confirms really that the ISMS is working, that those processes are all functioning correctly. ISO 27001 comes with 114 controls that your organisation must be compliant with, whether you think they're applicable or not. And that covers a bunch of things from your policies to your controls, human resource security, which is basically like HR policies and things like that, operations, communications, system acquisition, which is like buying stuff, deployment and maintenance of systems, And supplier relations, how do you deal with your vendors? What do you need to do to make sure they're secure? It's also got stuff around incident management and business continuity, and of course there's compliance throughout it all as well. ISO 27001, the actual certificate itself, expires every 3 years. So if you do it today, you've got 3 years before you need to do a full reassessment. But at the end of the first year and the end of the second year, they do what's called a surveillance audit, which is that sort of check to make sure that everything's still running along. There are arguments that that frequency should be higher in businesses, or actually, less frequent. But generally there is one at the end of year 1 and year 2. Developing your ISMS is a big project, and you'll most likely, in most organisations, you're going to need to bring in some consultants to help you. It's a lot of work. You're probably going to need 1 or maybe 2 people dedicated to that project at all times, at least for the first time you do it. Recertifications, they're a bit easier, but the first time you're building the ISMS, you're going to need dedicated people working on it. SOC 2 you can sort of do as a background task, not with the ISMS. You're going to go and touch every process basically in the company. You've got to do a lot of policy documentation and writing. It's a big investment. One fun fact is you can actually be ISO 27001 compliant, but not certified. So you can go ahead and you can do all the work, and you can go, yes, auditing myself, I am compliant. But that's not having a third-party auditor come in and actually validate that, which is where you get that certificate, that piece of paper. Now, the fun fact is that most people ask their vendors, are you ISO 27001 compliant, not certified? So there's sort of like a little sort of loophole there that I'm not surprised is being abused. It really isn't. There's not many people making use of this fact, but we all ask, are you compliant, not certified? From my perspective, ISO 27001, and this is going to be controversial, I think it's pretty poorly written. It's just not as mature as the other standards. It's not easily interpreted. There are a lot of auditors and consultants and organisations that when they go and look at the docs, they misinterpret what's the meaning of things. And this really sort of drives problems with ISO 27001, where it really sort of starts to push back on things like cloud-only organisations, where you don't have any physical infrastructure, you don't have a data centre, you don't really have networks. It sort of pushes back a bit on zero trust, because if you read it certain ways, you think you need VPNs for everything. It's not true, but if you read it and interpret it in certain ways, and your auditor does, you're going to need a VPN. Which sort of destroys zero trust and stuff as well. The other challenge is a lot of the way that the document is written, it talks about company-owned assets. And it places a lot of extra trust on a device that was bought by the company and is owned by the company compared to one that's maybe bought by another vendor or a consultant that's coming in or is personally owned by the user. One of the things that we're all taught when we start to look at zero trust is we don't really apply any different trust between one laptop and the other based on who owns it. We want to actually assess which is secure before we let it in. And so this whole focus on it has to be owned by the company, just sort of makes BYOD a bit difficult. And I've seen organisations actually get rid of BYOD because they don't know how to be compliant with it. And so if a company has gone through the process, they've got the piece of paper or they've got the report, what does that mean for us as a consumer? Be it an end user, be it another organisation, be it small, medium or large. When we go to buy some software from somebody, what does it mean when we see that they're ISO certified or they've got a SOC 2 report that's available? And then how do we trust this process of going through and doing the certification? Are we confident that the auditor actually did their work and that on a day-to-day basis the organisation is actually following the processes that they tell the auditor? And this is where things start to become a bit shaky. And the simple answer for this is we can't really. It's common, but it's wrong to assume that certification means that they're secure. It doesn't mean that at all. Having that certificate or that report doesn't mean an organisation's secure. It doesn't mean that they're, unhackable. It doesn't mean there's never going to be a privacy breach through some sort of accidental means. It means it's maybe a little bit less likely than another organisation, but we can't equate certification and security together. And a fun fact is if you have a look at Have I Been Pwned and you go through the list of organisations there's quite a few that are ISO and SOC 2 compliant. There's even one that provides ISO compliance audits. I found that one disturbing. So what does it actually mean? Well, first, the organisation has implemented some security controls, some processes, some policies, and they've done this according to a standard. They haven't just sort of made it up. They've actually looked at a standard and gone, this is, we're going to base our policies and processes off that. It means that they're actually continuously reviewing these policies and processes and procedures. If you're looking at a vendor and, they were renewed last year for SOC 2 and the year before and the year before and the year before, it means that at least once a year they think about security, which is kind of really good to see because some organisations might not do so. And finally, they've actually managed to demonstrate to an independent third party that they're following these processes. They're doing the things that they say they're doing, at least when the auditors were there. But what makes us able to trust all of this? Trust with all of this really comes down to a similar model as that of our certificate authorities and our CAs that issue web server certificates or email certificates. It's a hierarchy and it really comes down to the reputation of those doing the auditing that we put trust into it. So we need to start considering a few things before we go, hey, do I trust that this organisation is, going to be better than this other one that isn't certified? So there's a few things we need to think about. And the first is the organisation that came up with that standard. Do we trust it? Do we think that they know what they're doing when they come up with a security standard? Was it a bunch of people that were just, making up stuff at the pub? Or were they actually thinking about what they were doing? So if we think we can trust that, then we can also then actually look at the standard and go, do I trust that standard? Is there any obvious issues with the standard? There might be a standard, the cat dog 1 standard might have, must create an account called Kieran with the password cat dog 1 on all of your systems. That's probably not a standard you want to trust. And if you can't trust the standard, then you don't really need to continue the process because you're not going to trust it at all. But the next thing you need to think about is the process for selecting and certifying the people that are then going to go and do the audits. Do I trust that? Do I trust that when an organisation says, this company over here, Bob's Auditors, they're eligible and they're doing the audits correctly? Do we trust that process? And the challenge is, there are some quirks with the way these processes work. And we want to try and make sure that if you've got a different group or an organisation that are doing your audits from year to year, that they're sort of producing the same results. We don't want them to be too wildly different because that might mean that there's either a problem in the organisation or the audit process. The other thing is the way that these accredited sort of auditors are being managed. If there's a problem with one of them, are they removing them from the list quite actively? Are they keeping an eye, are they auditing the auditors, so to speak? That's a big part of it. Can we trust that if they fail, they're not allowed to be accredited auditors anymore? And then the big part, are we confident that individual auditors and inside these organisations, when they go out to customer site, are receiving the appropriate training and support? Certification providers really have to have really effective processes in terms of selecting who they hire and then how they train them. And that's to ensure that they've got the necessary skills and competence to go out and start to ask companies about sort of how they operate. And this is really important because, as I said, we don't want to have too much variance from auditor to auditor or certification provider to certification provider. And this is something that the national bodies that usually do this process, they have to have a lot of consistency and rules about how they approach it. So can we manipulate the audit process? A lot of people say, no, you can't manipulate the audit process. Actually, a lot of companies get away with some stuff that's not great. The biggest problem, in my opinion, is that audits, especially ISO audits, can be scoped to different parts of an organisation. So commonly, they will scope an ISO 27001 audit to just the IT team. They'll leave out HR and finance and various other parts of the business, even though their processes have IT impacts. And that actually renders some of the controls of ISO 27001 useless. They're there, they're functioning, but they're useless. Great example of this is if you've got a standard that says all employees must have a background check or a police check. If it's scoped to just IT, then organisations are only going to do background checks on the IT staff. So if you've got that fraudulent guy in finance or that dodgy person over in people and culture and HR, they don't get background checks done. They still pass the audits, they still get certified, but it's really starting to bend the terminology of an audit, of a standard that says all employees must have a successful completion of a background check. I've also seen the inverse of this, where companies have excluded their internal IT team. They might include only a specific delivery team or department or software development or their support part of their business. And the challenge with this is it sort of turns the whole thing into Swiss cheese or basically just a coat of paint on the wall, because it's the central internal IT teams that are controlling all of the accounts. They're doing the password management. They're controlling how the desktops are managed. The things that these teams are relying on, they just say, it's out of scope. It's a vendor that provides, our managed laptops. And so they're out of scope and the auditors don't see any problems, but there could be a lot of process problems there. And that's a common one, especially with the larger service providers and those multinationals. The other issue I've seen is scoping audits based on geographic regions. So you might have the Australian division is ISO certified, but not the American division. And say your client, you're getting work delivered to you from Australia and American teams, and they're like, yeah, we're ISO certified. Well, actually, only the team doing the stuff in Australia is. The American team isn't. And so the hybrid teams, these global teams, if there's scoping like that, can really start to, really fracture how we, trust in the process. To compound the issue, especially with ISO, the report you get doesn't say what's in scope or out of scope. It's a pretty standard little certificate. The SOC 2 report gives a little bit more information on what's scoped, but not enough for a consumer looking at that to be aware. Another challenge is, and I've seen it in Australia and some other sort of areas, is really accredited auditors shouldn't be providing, if a company is an accredited auditor firm, they shouldn't be providing consulting services. There's to keep the separation of those helping you to build your ISMS and those validating the ISMS. If you do a quick Google, you'll see that there's a lot of organisations that give you both. And they're separated by different divisions and legal entities and stuff, but it's all the same company. The reason that the standards bodies have defined this separation is to ensure that there's no conflict of interest, that the auditors aren't pressured to sign off on something just because they want that final check from the consulting work, which is more money than the audit work. There's also not much guidance out there for the auditors in terms of when they can and can't opt out of conflicts of interest. Say you're an auditor and you're auditing a big bank that also manage your home loan, or you've got shares in. There's nothing saying you have to opt out of that because there's a conflict. It's encouraged sometimes, but not really in all these situations where there might be benefits as a shareholder to get that certification. Your shares will go up, you'll make some more money. So there's a little bit, there's some gaps that need to be fixed in pretty much all the standards around this. So how can you as an organisation get the best value out of the process? And I've gone through a bunch of audits now, and I've tried to sort of pull together some of my ideas of how you can get better value. For me, it's more about the journey than the bit of paper at the end, even the report at the end for SOC 2. Because it's that process of going through and looking at things that you're going to get more business value out of. And many organisations, management's more concerned about getting it done so that they can start to show customers that they've done this thing than learning what's the problems that they need to fix. And so that's where some of the challenges come from. The other challenges really do come from communication. You really do need to have management, senior management need to be bought in. The board needs to have bought into getting this done. Every manager, every department needs to understand this is going to be impacting them. It's important. And this all comes down to really having those clearly defined goals, some clear justifications. We want to do this certification to get this, to be compliant with this standard because it will give us X, Y, and Z. And that needs to be shared with everybody in the organisation. A lot of the times there's a belief that it's only going to impact IT. It's not going to affect me in sales or in HR or in sort of development. Several years ago, I had a sales manager. He'd been pushing for us to be ISO 27001 certified for years. I think it was like 5 or 10 years at this point. And after pushback, we finally went, yeah, let's do it. We went through, and as part of that process, we identified some issues with the sales processes in his team that were leaving us in a bit of a grey zone in terms of risk and compliance. So we worked with the teams to update those. But he was really upset and frustrated. Why is IT driving change and making changes to my sales processes? Isn't just ISO, and he said to me, isn't ISO just some IT thing that you've been too lazy to do? And it's like, well, no, it affects everybody. It affects all of the business processes. And when he sat down and we talked about it, and actually the auditors came in and helped, we're explaining a lot of the scope to a group of us. That's when he realised it's not just IT. It's a wider than that. And not only did he become a big sort of champion for trying to get the other teams to, support us in the journey, he was a champion for the IT team well into the future as well. The other thing to think about with communication is if you say, hey, we're going to get an ISO certification, most IT people will shiver or scream. It doesn't have a great name. And that's because a lot of the time the communication's not been great from management around the why. Why are we doing this? IT people love to know the why. You have to clearly explain it to them. And then there's looking at the return on the investment. As there's some big promises with these, getting these standards and meeting these standards, and you're going to make an investment in time and a massive financial investment, 10,000 up to 100,000 or more. Like any other business investment, is it returning any value? How do I know that it's worth spending? It was worth spending, I should say, that $100,000. You need to develop some methods for being able to measure the value once you've been certified as compliant. And that might be number of user sign-ups, customer satisfaction surveys, whatever it might be. It's critical though that you've got these things. If I'm going to spend $20,000 for SOC 2, and I'm a company that sells $10 a year subscriptions, am I going to make an extra 2,000 sign-ups that year to cover the costs? Because if I'm not going to make an extra 2,000 sign-ups, it's not worth it. So you need to start being able to measure these things. And the other thing is, at the end of that recertification process, that's when you need to look at these metrics. You know, if you go through a year, you've been SOC 2 certified, you've spent the 20,000 and you've only gotten 10 more sign-ups than the previous year, are you going to invest another 20,000 again? Probably not. And that's an important thing that a lot of orgs kind of miss out on. And they just waste a lot of money. The other thing is, it's a long-term investment. An ISO audit is a 3-year thing. You know, once you're certified, there's another 3 years. And so that's a pretty long time for an IT vendor assessment. Most companies don't like signing 3-year vendor agreements for Microsoft licensing or Atlassian licensing. They want 1 or 2 years. So when you're looking at an ISO audit, you know, you've got to be sure that that's something you want to do. And then there's about finding the right auditor. The right auditor and the right consultants make the process so much easier and make it so much more enjoyable. The audits that I have enjoyed and gotten the most value out of as somebody involved are the ones where I've had a really smart auditor and really smart consultants involved. A bad auditor, a bad consultant supporting you along the way is just going to make you all miserable. There are a wide range of organisations that are out there to support you. Shop around. Don't just pick the big 4. I don't think that they're really a good fit for most organisations, especially a lot of startups. You know, shop around, look for others. They're there, they will be able to help you. When it comes time to deciding who you want to go with, you know, ask them, can I talk to a customer? Can I get some, you know, feedback from them? Can I actually see a report that you've produced? Like a real report, you know, even if it's just a SOC 3 report, so I can see the quality of your work. Talk to them about their corporate culture. You know, if you're a startup and, you know, it's BYOD and, you know, it's everything's fast and there's no, you know, everything's in the cloud and, you know, you're using Git to store all of your documents, and then you're talking to an auditor that's still putting stuff in a Windows file share and, you know, it's a domain joined laptop from the 80s, that cultural conflict is going to cause you some issues. And so maybe you need to look for a different auditor. The other thing is, as I said, there's automation tools coming out. There's more and more vendors in this space that will help you do the audits, collect all the evidence, track where you are, see where you fall out of compliance. When you're looking at who's going to help you with an audit, ask them if they're going to support doing that. I've spoken to some of them going, nah, I don't know how to do that. We're not going to use that tool. You'll still need to email us all the files. And then I've spoken to others that are like, oh yeah, we use this app or that app or that app. Just give us a login creds, you know, for a, you know, read-only account and we can go and do the rest. You know, look at the ones that support automation. Look at implementing those audit tools. And as I was saying earlier, it's an investment that is a long one. So really be sure about who you're picking up because you are signing a 3-year agreement in some cases. The other thing is don't be afraid to start small. Don't be afraid to just start with SOC 2 Type 1. Get that done and dusted. Even if you don't have the controls in place, get them to look at what you want to do. Especially if you're a startup that's maybe 20 people, you want to start putting some of these controls in place, design them out, get them to have a look at it, then implement it. Then go and look at SOC 2 Type 2. That will assess if what you've done is actually working, which is really, really powerful. You'll get feedback faster too, because you've already had some lot of feedback, now you're getting some more feedback. Don't forget though to ask for your SOC 3 report as well. You'll probably have to pay an extra fee, but so many companies forget about getting the SOC 3 report and try and send me SOC 2 reports. That's why I want to just keep reminding everybody. If you still think that you need to go for an ISO audit, that's when you go and do your ISO 27001. Consider doing an internal compliance audit where somebody that's maybe from another team or department puts the auditor hat on and pretends to be the auditor and actually validates it before you go and pay the auditor to do it. It'll build your confidence. It will also give you faster feedback loops. We talk about Agile, we talk about DevOps as faster feedback loops. You can apply some of the same principles to getting certified. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to me today. It's a bit of a dry subject. It's not the most exciting thing. Thank you all for listening to me today.